In this video, we're going to learn about ngOnChanges or the onChanges lifecycle hook. We've already learned about the onInit lifecycle hook. However, we're going to learn about the onChanges lifecycle hook. So the onChanges is extremely important, and I'm going to demonstrate why. So we obviously in the last video learned how to create these immutable changes. So we do not need this console log anymore. So we'll just simply remove that. So what I can do is set up a quick div just to demonstrate this issue. Now, when we close this off, what we can do is just simply do passenger.fullname. So when I start typing in this local component, you'll actually see the changes reflect up here. So let's go and demonstrate this in the browser. So you can see our new list, we just have the 5 names of our passengers and we have all the logic below for the other passengers. So let me demonstrate the issue here. So let me highlight this and I'm going to start typing Todd Motto, and you can see all of these changes are instantly being reflected. Now, this is not strictly abiding by the rules of one-way data flow because the component should have its own local state, and when we click done, we should then update the parent piece of data. So this is where we can introduce something called the ngOnChanges. You may not have to use this, or you may not like to use this. It depends on your situation of what you're actually coding. So let's go back and implement the onChanges lifecycle hook. To implement the lifecycle hook, we need to look at the details component. Just like the onInit, we can actually import onChanges from Angular core. We can scroll down to our component class, and we can say that it implements the onChanges lifecycle hook. Now you can see here that it says property ngOnChanges is missing. So this is where we need to actually go and add our onChanges. So we can just simply do ngOnChanges. Now before we even do anything, we're actually going to look at this changes object. So what we're going to do is do a console log. ngOnChanges gives us a changes object. So at runtime, we will be able to see this object. So let's take a look in the browser at how this gets called and what this object looks like. So when we look in the browser, we have 5 objects which are being called because Angular is at runtime before the component is actually initialized, giving us these details as simple change objects. So when we actually expand one of them, we see the current value and the previous value. Now, these won't have any previous values because this is an initialization. However, it will have a current value, which is an object with all our data inside. So what we can do to avoid actually updating the parent when we start making these changes is use the onChanges lifecycle hook to essentially break the binding between the parent and the child component. Now, this is not an issue related to Angular. This is just how JavaScript works in general. If you've created a variable before and try to update it elsewhere, you'll notice that the original source of that variable will change. So this is exactly what's happening because Angular is giving us the array via a reference rather than a value. So each time we change a value in our local component, it's actually changing that initial reference to the object. So let's go back and use this ngOnChanges to actually fix this issue. So because our input is called detail, which we just saw the detail as a simple change object, what we can do in ngOnChanges is do if changes.detail. So here we're just going to do a simple safety check before we actually start to do anything. And we can just simply override this .detail. So you might think this is slightly strange because we have an input called detail, but we're going to actually reassign this .detail. So we are in fact going to do this. We're going to use object assign, and we're going to pass in an empty object. And what we're actually going to merge is the current value of this change. So in this second argument, we're going to do changes.detail.current value. So you might be thinking, why are we doing this in an onChanges rather than when the component is actually initialized? So let me demonstrate something which will teach you more about the lifecycle hooks in Angular. So we do ngOnInit in here, and we'll add a console log for the ngOnChanges. Now we'll quickly go and implement this as well. So we'll do on init. We'll go ahead and import that from here. So we're importing onChanges on init. We're using a comma separator to implement both the interfaces. We're using ngOnChanges and we're using ngOnInit, which we've already covered in this section of the course. So let's go ahead to the browser. So you can see here that we have ngOnChanges, ngOnInit, ngOnChanges, and so forth. Now what this actually means is that ngOnChanges gets called before ngOnInit. So that means that the bindings and the data is actually set up or available in this ngOnChanges before the component is initialized. So this allows us to intercept that detail binding, which is why we do this.detail, and we basically create a clone of it and reassign it back to itself. And why do we do this? Because when I click on edit, I can then start typing Todd Motto, and you can see that Stephen in the parent data hasn't been updated. However, when I click done, it's now been updated to Todd Motto. So we've completed the circle here on using a one-way data flow, and we've also learned how to implement ngOnChanges should you ever need to do something like this in the future. We've also learned how to remove passengers, which you can see are being instantly reflected in the parent. We can edit passengers locally, we can change their names, we can update the parent. So this is essentially one-way data flow with local state changes. When something's ready to change, we fire an event to the parent, we merge those changes in, and any other properties that rely on it, even something so simple as the total checked in. So if I start removing more of these properties also rely on the parent data. So you can see how useful one-way data flow is, because we can make changes to things and they do not affect other components in the application until a specific point in time. So the data flows down and the events flow up.